Well, this evening we're going to be talking about greed versus generosity. I got real quiet, so I'm not sure if people are going, oh, well, I already know this, or you're going, ooh, this, you hit my spot here. So let's just simply start with this question. Can you think of anyone who refers to themselves as greedy and means it? Not as a joke. You can actually think of someone who will say, and do they act that way also? I'm asking Clay. Clay said he knows one person. Do they act that way?
Kevin O'Leary.
Okay, I don't know who that is.
He's a billionaire and all he wants is money.
Okay, but does he say, I'm greedy and that's all I want? Okay. I'm wondering how many people actually do it. And Robert, you said you kind of... Okay. Without getting into politics, I think that's I don't think he's ever said, I'm greedy.
I've seen when you read his book, he talks about how you have to have the tribe.
Okay. So, and that could be. So there are a couple of people in this world, but would you say it's kind of a minority? Do you know anyone personally who says, yeah, I'm greedy? Well, when you think about it then, let's ask this. 2,000 years ago, if it's not all that common today for people to admit they're greedy or say that they are, if it's one of those, people will almost admit to anything else and with pride. Greed is one of those culturally where you just don't do it. And when you do, you're kind of pointed out, aren't you? And so in this case, what about 2,000 years ago? Was it a common thing for people to say they're greedy? I would say no. Then in that case, then why is it that the Bible talks about greed? If everyone kind of agrees it's not good to be greedy. It doesn't mean we're not. And it also means that sometimes the way we do this, we put ourselves first in such a way that we end up being selfish or greedy without knowing it. Or, and this is something that you'll find in business schools, Mitch, that was business school in the last century. Let's get the new century here. Vance, in the new century, do they still talk about the pie? Well, yeah. Well, it depends on what kind of pie. Okay, is it bad to leave something on the plate? Okay, to magnify things. If you're leaving it on the plate, in other words, there's only so much pie to go around. Every time someone else gets a piece of pie, that's one less piece of pie that you can get. That is a very common belief. Think about children. At a very early age, perhaps, children will be nice and you hand them something and they hand it back, but then they become human after a couple of minutes. And what happens then when you hand them something and you try to get it back? Your hand comes back a stump. And so some of us know this. Some of us live this, isn't this right, every day? And so, because it's a natural thing. But it's also something that comes about many of us. There's just a little sting when somebody else gets something that we don't have. I don't know about you, but while reading the Vancouver Sun newspaper, which I've never read in my life, but I found online, this is Vancouver, Canada, so that's why they can't spell. Okay, they're not even Americans, we know, but we won't go into that. The reality is that greed, listen to this little editorial. The reality is that greed is a contemptuous word that is purposely used to stir emotions and negatively smear the principal tenet of human behavior, self-interest. Boy, somebody got paid by the word. Simply put, self-interest is the human desire to improve our situation or the concern of one's own advantage and well-being, according to Merriam-Webster. Of course, that is a partial definition of Merriam-Webster, but not the entire definition. If you want to win your argument, you use just the part that you like. And so in this case, it's this. If I don't look after myself, who will? Janine?
Anybody watches the Titans that built America on the History Channel?
The ti- the History Channel, when they're actually showing history and not building knives? Yes.
They are just, absolutely, this man has done it, I've got to do better, I've got to do better.
I've got to do, yes, that attitude of, as you'll find, whether it's Carnegie, whether it's Rockefeller, whether it's any of those old people, and even the people today, the idea is I must do better. Why? Well, people that like them say, well, because they're driven. But why? What would be the answer?
Do they just want to magnify themselves above the person before them?
It could be that they want to magnify, they want to be better than the other people. And I'm sure that's part of it. But I'm also they're obsessed with they must have it. They must have it. Whatever it is, they must have. So maybe this thing about greed is a little more common than we think. Consider, if you would, in 2 Chronicles, if you would turn there with me. In 2 Chronicles, the 9th chapter, we'll give you a minute to go. Why you haven't already turned there like I have, I don't know. I put pieces of paper in everything now, so I can just turn. And we're going to begin in verse 22. Verse 22. Thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom, and all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver, of gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. And Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots, and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And he ruled over all the kings from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shephelah. And horses were imported for Solomon from Egypt and from all lands. And again, those of you that get up here and want to read stuff, you're reading the Old Testament, you come to something you don't know. The secret is you start on it, you read through it, and you keep on going, and you don't look back. And you say, well, of course I pronounced it correctly. Why did he have all these things? It says at the very beginning in 22 and 23, why is he receiving all of these things? Well, they want something back, and because they're asking, he has something that they will use. Yeah, the wisdom that God gave. Let's take two pieces of things and put them together. Knowledge is knowing stuff. Again, if you can't explain something simply, if you have to use big words, you're above my head. And I don't know it. Knowledge is knowing stuff. Wisdom is knowing how to use what you know. He has that. Will that guarantee, listen to me carefully now, will that guarantee a connection and a fellowship with God? Just those two things. Because there has to be a willingness on your part to do something. And so here's what Solomon has. And maybe this is one reason, if you look in the New Testament, Solomon's really not mentioned at all. David is, isn't he? Solomon, in fact, in Jewish culture, Solomon is not really looked on as a major character in that. He has all these things, but that's not all that he has. If you go back to 1 Kings, the 11th chapter, and beginning in verse 1, excuse me. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to those in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses rather. Boy, that's a lot of principals. That would be, you put all those together in a school, there would be trouble. But there were 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God. That was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. Here is a man who has wisdom. He has knowledge. He knows what God wants. He has wisdom, and yet he does these things. Why does he do that? Does he go in and, I'm sorry, I'm just used to work. This is how it works in my head. I'm not trying to make things juvenile to you. But all I can picture is Scrooge McDuck going into his vault of gold. If you've ever seen those old cartoons, and if you have grandkids, you have to watch them. And he's swimming in his gold, and that's what makes him happy. The physical touch of the money is what really makes him happy. Just having the things is what makes him happy. Is that what Solomon's doing? Would Solomon say, I'm greedy? How would you justify if you were Solomon in doing this? Vance?
You might say that these things that I have are rightly earned by all the things that I give and my wisdom and leadership to all. I mean, look at this kingdom I have. So
Yeah.
obviously, people are doing well because I'm doing well.
Good. All these things are, it's payback. In other words, it's the thing. I give you wisdom, you give me stuff in return. Why are they all princesses? Robert?
Political alliances. He's not only playing the economic game, quid pro quo, but he's also playing the political game. A lot of these marriages that he was in were for alliances.
And so he's setting things up. I think that's a good way of putting it. He's setting things up because he's saying, this is how I'm going to protect Israel. We're going to protect Israel from Egypt. And how are we going to do that? We're going to marry into that line. How do they do it up to 100 years ago? For those of you that, not you, because he's told me his interest in World War I. Who's all related in World War I among all the kings and queens? Just say all of them. All of them. Just about, in Europe, just about all of them. Okay? The Queen of Greece is the daughter of Victoria. Okay? The grandson of Victoria is the Tsar of Russia. The grandson of Victoria is the Kaiser in Germany. And we're not even getting into Finland, Holland, and et cetera, et cetera. So why would they do that? Because they just like each other? No, because they're trying to set up alliances. And that's what he's doing. So for a guy that says, I'm wise, he's given wisdom, what does he do? He says, I know better. I will do something different. So, how do we know that? Well, if you would turn way back one last time in the Old Testament to Deuteronomy. No, it's not one last time in the Old Testament. There'll be one more after this. Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter. And we're looking now at verses 14 through 17. Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 17. Here are some laws that God put forth to Israel. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses? Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excess gold and silver. And when, I'm going to go on one more verse. And when he sets on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priest. One more. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it in the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them. And I'll stop right there. Hundreds of years before he's around, Solomon's around, what are they told specifically not to do? What Solomon did. Again, let me ask you, does Solomon go, well, I don't know. I have a hard time putting myself in the mind of someone from 3,000, 4,000 years ago. Okay, human beings are the same, but I mean, there's a lot of cultural stuff going. Last time I checked, I've never been a king. Okay? Of the household, yes. She did it kind of, yeah. The point being, though, that can you be greedy without knowing it? Can you become, in God's eyes, greedy about something without really knowing it? So what should you do? What's one thing you can do? One thing you can do is by adopting a biblical view of life, you will see how they handle things. Go back one more time, and this time I promise it'll probably be the last time in the Old Testament, to Leviticus. Mark, what'd you just do?
I'm just reading. What did you do?
Hey, that's good enough. Then you know when we're going to be finished.
Just keep going, I'm good.
Okay. Leviticus 19. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after you harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. The poor and the foreigner didn't work to reap those harvests. Why should they get any? This is a national law. I find it when you think about it, it's repeated, by the way, in 23:22, but it's more of a kind of a spiritual law there. This is a national law for Israel. In other words, this is like the United States Senate and the House and the President signs a law that says this is what every person in the United States has to do that farms. They have to leave this. They didn't. Let me ask again. They didn't reap. They didn't harvest. Why should they get anything? Why should we? I'm going to take that as a step because I know you can help me here. Why should we be generous? Okay, God may be generous, but why is generosity good? This is where people will get stuck who don't have a Bible mindset. People that are nice people, people that have good morals, that all those kind of things, but when you ask them this kind of thing, they're going to run out of if you keep unpacking it, they're going to go, well, just because. Why is murder bad? If you don't have a biblical reason for it, sooner or later, you don't really have a reason at all. It's just because society says so. Vance's dad. I forgot Mitch, sorry. He didn't recognize himself.
Friends is the idea that you think it's yours.
Yeah.
So everything that we have really is in its arms, right? This was by God. We're stewards of that. So that's probably the mindset that we need to have.
Yeah.
How am I taking care of it? God happen to bless me with? And then the other thing is, you know, I think that, you know, the Bible says that we have to
That's good. Good. Don?
It's also the way God taking care of his own. The food, the birds, all, he has a plan, and that was the way to implement it the best way.
Good. In case you can't go. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry. If you didn't hear, Don was saying that's how God takes care of his own, just as the birds, etc. Judy?
I was gonna say the same thing that Mitch said, not quite as eloquent as he.
Okay. I couldn't quite hear, but Judy said she's going to say the same thing, but something about elephants. I didn't quite understand what that was, and so.
God knew it was that having things for.
Now you're a teacher. What happens when your student puts their hand over their mouth and starts talking? Yeah. You're the only one I've done that to.
Many things are a burden, and the older you get, the more of a burden it becomes. So you
Yeah.
burden yourself and you let go.
Good. Oh, Vance.
Maybe it's not something that in the Old Testament could be clearly understood for us. I mean, Paul to Philippians, it says, do not think yourself sufficient to conceive your regard of others is more important than yourself. And it doesn't in there, it's not just what Paul says, so Paul is that would have that attitude when he was in Christ. And so it's actually a demonstration of Christ-like behavior, even though that's kind of disconnected at this point in the Old Testament. But as we look at that, we can learn why, to answer your question, why the generosity
Yeah.
is so important, because Christ was generous to us.
Well, and see, even beyond that, if we can maybe unpack it one more step, where I was thinking was this. What are the two great commandments, whether Old Testament or New Testament? The first is, who do you respect and give all your allegiance to? God. What's the second one? And then, of course, we can get into that, lawyer thing of, well, who's my neighbor? Well, when they ask that, what are they really asking? They're asking, who can I leave out? Who can we just kind of say, no, you're not my neighbor? And he says anyone, and the answer I think is anyone that you come in contact with. Notice that this law is not one that's set up for just Jews. This is anyone who's sojourning. What does that tell us about our lives and generosity? Because wouldn't those that refuse to do that be counted as greedy? And so, where is our generosity? See, we're in this, and now we get into this striking point, which I think is real. It's real because it's real to me. And that is, I have an obligation to my family that I need to meet. So there's obviously some things that I have to look at. I have to prepare for a future because God has asked me to within certain circumstances. It's those circumstances that I always have to challenge myself. I think that we have to see. Okay? We gather up money. We gather up money in a congregation. We gather up money so that we can do certain things. But then if we start asking ourselves, well, my superintendent, when I first started at Norris, Mr. Waite, you remember Mr. Waite? Yes, you remember Mr. Waite. The overhead projector broke for our rooms, for all of 8th grade. We only had one. It broke. There was a new overhead projector this is my first or second year there, in the back room. So Rick Perucci, who was principal at the time, went and said, hey, the projector's broken, can we use it? His reply is a great one, because I don't know what was in his mind when he said it, but I have an idea. He goes, well, Rick, if you use it, it won't be new. I didn't find that real funny back then. But today, isn't that how we lead our lives? If I draw that down, it may be down and I may need something. Well, then why don't you just throw your mortgage, Larry, into the pot next time it comes around when they do the thing? Well, because God has given me some responsibilities elsewhere, hasn't he? So it's not like, that's what makes it a difficult thing for each and every one of us. And that's what makes the thing for a congregation, for elders who have to worry with that and have to look and see what those things are and how they can use that. It's one of those things where luckily, most of us don't have to worry about. Let's see, I'm behind here. John 12, verses 4 through 6. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Greed is, you remember when they used to talk about certain drugs were gateway drugs into bigger drugs? They don't use that term anymore, do they? They just figured out that everything is a gateway. Okay, all drug use. But how about this? Greed is a gateway sin to greater sin. Because once you start it, you don't go back. And that's what we see here. This begins as greed. Here's our pie. Well, if we take out some of the pie and give to others, well, then the pie won't be there for me. And where does that go as it goes along? We know where it goes, where he gets his 30 pieces of silver, as the Old Testament foretold, and he throws it down at their feet, and they just laugh at him. And he can't handle it, and he doesn't know how to handle it, and he doesn't know how to ask, or he won't ask for forgiveness. He's gone so far, I mentioned this on a Wednesday night, he's gone so far through so many doors that, where he could have turned around, where it's just not in him to do it. And he kills himself. In 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, verse 11, Paul says, "And now I'm writing you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother." Now I'm going to stop you right there. This could go into a couple of different things that I don't really want to get into tonight as to who this is alluding to. Is this talking about, I'll just throw out a couple there and we'll just go on. Is this talking about a brother who sins, and even though he says, "I don't want to be part of you," you still are going to say, "No, you can't do that. I'm still going to kind of keep you away"? Or is this a brother who says, "Yeah, I've sinned, but I still want to be part of the group"? Okay, it doesn't really matter right now who he's talking about on that. That's a good discussion, but could come later. In this case, it says if he's guilty of sexual immorality, and then what do they put right next to that? Greed. Or an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. Paul lists greed in the same breath as sexual immorality and drunkenness. Have you noticed Christians treating greed as seriously as we treat sexual immorality? Or is it because we don't even think about it? Because we don't hear anyone today just saying, "I'm greedy"? Could be. And for Americans, a particular thing, greed, we're usually talking about money. Not always. It can be time. It can be a bunch of other things, as we'll talk about in a minute. But when you talk about money and you talk to Americans, they get very, very defensive. You ask someone about money and they're going to tell you it's none of your business. You ask Christians about money and they're going to get, for the most part, I'm talking, there are always exceptions, but they're going to get very defensive. That comes down to a matter of trust. Do you actually trust the person you're talking to? I know that's harsh, because that means that if an elder comes to me and says, I need to talk to you about money, and I get very defensive and I get upset, what I'm saying to him is, I don't trust you. I think you're going to use this against me somehow. And until we break that cycle, it's very difficult to talk about this kind of subject. And that's one reason why it doesn't come up all that often. No, don't ask me about my bank accounts in the Caribbean. Can I come back here for just a second and ask this? Judas has the money box bag. Who gave it to him? We know who gave it to him. Jesus did. Why?
It kind of goes with Robert's sermon today because he knows Judas still has that 50% chance to make the right decision, and he really wants him to make the right decision.
The challenge is going to be there, isn't it? As it is for all of us in different ways. It may not be the money bag. It may be something else. But as we see here, now this is not a way for everyone to go, hey, I need to raise my contribution. I'm saying that what we're talking about is not just money. We're talking about a lifestyle where, in fact, you are helping others. If we help just members of the church and no one else, are we doing what God wants? Thank you. Kind of scared me. It got real quiet. The whole gleaning, there's more to it, isn't there? Mm-hmm. Now, we know that there's certain monies that can be used, God's money, we believe, in certain ways. And the money of the contribution can be used to help saints. And when Galatians, it makes that difference when it talks about helping others, and then kind of, I'm paraphrasing, particularly of the household of faith. It says, I recognize there are those that need help, and there is the household of faith that need help. And the treasury is set aside to help with that, along with the spread of the gospel.
Okay, but as the farmer, if I'm the farmer, I have laid by and stored what I'm going to be giving. And then in addition to that, from my field, I have to leave some to be gleaned. Separate from what I would give to the church, I still have to do that as well.
I think that's a very good point. If you couldn't quite hear, she sounded like I did a couple of weeks ago with that voice. And that is kind of Lucille Ball early on in the 50s, kind of that. But this idea that not only are we setting aside money and goods and sacrifice in the Old Testament to meet those needs and responsibilities that we have, but on top of that, we're also setting aside the grounds and leaving the gleaning for there. So in other words, it's not just stuff that's going to go to the congregation or to the tabernacle for sacrifices for the Levite priests, etc. There's also stuff we have a responsibility of setting aside to help others. So how does a zero-sum belief indicate little or no faith in the generosity of God? That's a fancy way. When I put that, what I simply meant was this. When this happens, do we end up, when we get into this idea of a pie, when you get something and I am jealous over it because it's no longer there and now I'll lose out, what does that say about my belief in God? It's amazing what happens when you unpack these things a little bit and just kind of think one step deeper. It doesn't take a whole lot because it's in there. If we believe there would be generous and not greedy, then what changes for you? You know, it's a personal question that each one of us have to look at. I'll share one. I don't know if I'm greedy by teaching the class. I'm having a hard time doing this. I'm having a really difficult time physically and emotionally and mentally doing this. Am I doing this, because I've been asking myself, am I doing this simply because of pride, because I want to teach? And if that's the case, in other words, I've had people come and go, hey, we like what you're teaching. I'll tell you, I don't listen to that. I appreciate it, but I don't listen to it. The only ones I ever listen to is if someone tells someone else, and then they come and happen to mention it to me. That's a real, that's something positive. The rest is you just kind of have to take, because people are polite and nice. And I don't know, I'm thinking sometimes that I am greedy for this. That other people could be up here doing this. This idea that you owe me to listen to me is something I don't agree with at all. And so it's a challenge for me to kind of get through this. And I do appreciate you going. Robert, go ahead.
Well, too, I think when we talk about reading, you mentioned it briefly, but I think it bears expounding. Is to use economic terms, to give a greater supply of ourselves than is the demand that is the basic, basement level demand that the scripture requires of us.
Okay, I appreciate that. As we look at this and we kind of finish it up and we see this idea of we want to be generous, we want to understand that greed, see, this is another reason. I keep remembering things after I've already brought it, when I should have brought it up. I'm getting things mixed up. I'm getting things out of order. I don't like that. But just imagine this. All these things that we've been talking about come back to something I mentioned at the very first time, and that idea of the worldview. Go back to worldviews in the beginning, whether it's a deist, that idea, God has set it up and all that, or whether it's the romantics. Romantics is not kissy-kissy, as I used to tell the 8th graders. Romantic means a hero. And in the romantic thing, the hero is mankind. Or whether it's Darwin, with the idea that religion is bad because it doesn't place an emphasis on the individual. I will mention this with Darwin. Darwin's cousin, I know a bunch of little facts that come to me every once in a while. But Darwin's cousin in England was actually the one that began this idea. I shouldn't have done this because now it went away. When we talk about killing individuals because they are not pure or not, what is that called? Eugenics. In fact, eugenics is the basis of evolutionary thought. Okay, it's not well known and it's not mentioned because they don't want to mention it, but it's historically it is there. Like Planned Parenthood was originally a eugenics-led thing. All right, but come back to all of those things that we're talking about. Nietzsche, whether it's postmodernism, all of that stuff, and who cares what it is, it comes down to this. The individual gets to choose. I choose for me. I mean, it really is a simple thing. I choose for me. And when it comes down, and that's what happened to Solomon. I choose for me. That's what happened to Judas. I choose for me. And what makes it so bad with Solomon, look at all the gifts he was given. So the next time we go, well, I have all this knowledge, I have all this wisdom, not as much as Solomon. And same thing with Judas. He sat beside Jesus. If we sat beside a famous person, we immediately text everyone, don't we? Oh, do you know who I sat by? Do you know who I saw at the store? He sat by Jesus. Didn't seem to help. Well, on the 24th, we're going to see who is naughty and who's nice. And Janine, you get the last word unless I decide I'm not.
Generosity is an item on which we will be judged, and it's mentioned in Matthew 25.
Yeah, generosity is something we will be judged on. That's a good point. And Matthew 25. Next week, individualism versus community. And we're through. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.